It's the year 1932. Weimar Republic is falling apart, faster than anyone could explain. The streets have turned violent, unemployment is at its peak. But in the middle of all this, a fascist scholar named Schmitt writes down the most dangerous political theory of the 20th century. He calls it friend-enemy distinction. The idea was simple. When a leader is losing power, he finds an enemy strong enough to feel like a real threat, because a population that believes it is under threat will never remove the man protecting them. It doesn't matter if the threat is real. It only matters that the people believe it is. Schmitt was not just describing a tactic, he was describing a system that had been running from decades and worshipped by every fanatic leader. From Hitler calling Jews a threat to Saddam invading Kuwait. Every time when a leader felt the ground shifting beneath him, an enemy appeared at the gates. Schmitt had no idea that 90 years later, a man in Tel Aviv would build the longest political career in history of Israel entirely on that one idea. We know Benjamin Netanyahu as Israel's protector, its iron shield, but through Schmitt's framework, he is not the shield, he is the proof. In 1995, Shimon Peres was leading Israel toward peace. The Oslo Accords had just been signed, and for the first time in decades, Israel was beginning to believe that a different future was possible. Then, in the span of just 9 days, Hamas detonated 4 suicide bombs across Israel. 60 people were killed. The sense of peace collapsed overnight. And suddenly, the man who had never stopped warning about the enemy was standing exactly where the country needed him to be. Netanyahu then won the 1996 election by less than 30,000 votes. This is the moment Schmitt warned us about. Schmitt never argued that leaders invent their enemies from scratch. What he argued was that the truly dangerous leader is not the one who creates the threat. He is the one who knows exactly how to position himself inside it, and understands that a frightened population does not look for the most qualified man. It looks for the most certain one who saves them. And Netanyahu has always been the most certain man in the room. But Schmitt's theory has one uncomfortable implication that almost nobody talks about. If a leader's entire power is built on the existence of a threat, what happens the moment threat he faces is no longer external? What happens when the danger is not at the border, but in the courtroom? That question got its answer in 2019. Benjamin Netanyahu was alleged with 3 serious corruption charges related to bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, which made him stand before the judge. For the first time in Israeli politics, a sitting prime minister was facing the possibility of prison. His allies began to distance themselves. Opposition parties were forming alliances with one purpose: to remove him. And this time, the protests in Tel Aviv were not about Gaza or Lebanon. They were about him. For a brief moment, it looked like Schmitt's system had finally met its limit. The enemy card had been played too many times. And finally, accountability had caught up with the man who had spent 30 years outrunning it. Then, Iran announced it was accelerating its nuclear program. Netanyahu went on national television, stood in front of a map of the Middle East, and said what he had been saying for decades: Israel is under threat, and I am the only one who sees it clearly enough to stop it. Suddenly, the charges became less important to discuss in front of the national threat, and when a population is forced to choose between justice and security, Schmitt already knew which one they would pick. He wrote, "The existence of a real enemy is almost irrelevant. What matters is the perception of one, because perception is what moves people. And people moving towards fear are always moving away from accountability." Netanyahu had not escaped the courtroom. He simply made it feel small. But even Schmitt knew that a system built entirely on fear has one fatal weakness. It only works as long as the leader is there to point at the threat. The moment he disappears, the fear disappears with him. In 2021, his opponents finally tested this theory. A coalition of 8 parties with completely opposing ideologies had united around a single shared purpose: to end Netanyahu's political career. Benjamin Netanyahu was removed from his office, and Naftali Bennett became Prime Minister of Israel. It seemed like Israel had finally moved on from one-man politics. But Schmitt had written something about this moment too. Sovereignty does not travel in a straight line. It retreats, it waits, and it returns the moment the population feels that only one man understands the nature of the threat well enough to face it. Bennett's coalition was fragile by design. 8 parties were held together by nothing except their opposition to one man. Within a year, the cracks were visible and coalition collapsed. And in December 2022, Netanyahu returned to power again. Not because he had changed or the charges got disappeared, but because, in a country where every decade has been lived by an existential threat, The man who speaks the language of survival will always find his way back to the podium. Schmitt called this the logic of exception. Normal rules, accountability, legal consequence only hold as long as the situation feels normal. The moment it stops feeling normal, the sovereign returns, not by force or by revolution, simply by being the only man in the room who never stopped pointing at the enemy. But this time, something was different. Netanyahu had won the election, but was unable to win the hearts of its citizens. His government had pushed a controversial judicial overhaul that was strategically designed to weaken the Supreme Court's ability to overturn government decisions. 500,000 Israelis protested against this decision. Even Israel's closest allies, Washington, began to quietly distance themselves from his government. For the first time in 30 years, there was no enemy large enough to change the conversation. Then, on the morning of October 7th, everything resets.
More than 700 Israelis are now feared dead.
It was the darkest day in the history of Israel, the Hamas terror rampage and mass abduction on the 7th of October.
Turning to that breaking news from Israel, the militant group Hamas launching a surprise attack on the country.
Hamas launched the largest terrorist attack on Israeli soil since its founding. 1,200 people were killed and 250 taken as hostages. It was the single greatest intelligence failure in Israeli history. This is the moment Schmitt's theory becomes something darker than a political observation. Schmitt wrote that crisis does not just save the sovereign from his enemies, it transforms him. The man being investigated yesterday becomes the man nation cannot afford to lose today. After October 7th, hostage families stood outside Netanyahu's residence demanding answers. Former intelligence chiefs publicly questioned the workings of Mossad and the government. The pressure was building from every direction, and Netanyahu did what he had always done. He pointed outward, at Hamas, at Iran, and Hezbollah. He told the world Israel was not fighting a war, it was fighting for its existence. Schmitt had written in 1922 that the sovereign is whoever decides the state of exception, whoever has the authority to say, normal rules do not apply right now. In Israel today, that man is still Benjamin Netanyahu. Between 2008 to 2023 alone, Israel and Hamas reached 6 ceasefire agreements. Every single one collapsed. Most people assume this is because the conflict is too deep, too historical to ever end. But there is another explanation, one that Schmitt identified a century ago. He wrote that a sovereign built entirely on the existence of an enemy cannot survive that enemy's absence, because the moment the conflict pauses, the population stops looking outward and starts looking inward at the economy, at national progress, and at the man sitting in courtroom facing serious corruption charges. Netanyahu understood this before he could articulate it. In 2008, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert put the most generous peace offer in Israeli history on the table, a real two-state solution of divided Jerusalem. Netanyahu was in opposition at the time, but as when he returned to power the following year, that offer was never revisited. Schmitt predicted it with uncomfortable precision. The sovereign not just needs the enemy to survive, he needs the war to remain unfinished, because a finished war removes the only thing that makes him irreplaceable. And in 30 years of Netanyahu's power, not a single peace process survived long enough to become a reality. And here is what makes all of this even more unsettling. Carl Schmitt did not just write the theory, he lived it, just enough to become it real. Schmitt joined the Nazi Party in May 1933. He saw his own writing come to life. Hitler had found his enemies, the Jews and the communists. He made them feel like an existential threat to Germany's survival, and he made himself the only man capable of defeating them. Everything Schmitt had described, Hitler made it a reality. Netanyahu is not Hitler. That comparison is too simple and too dishonest to make, but he is operating a system that Schmitt first described in a collapsing Weimar Republic in 1932. The same system that a different leader in a different collapsing republic used to end democracy entirely. The system does not care who runs it. It only cares that the enemy never disappears.